Have you ever wondered what it was like to be a teacher or a student in a what we would now call a classical school, a school of humanistic studies during the golden age of that style of education and schooling, from, let's say, the 1500s into the 1800s, so from the 16th century into the 19th century? What was it like? What was school actually like? What was the curriculum like? And what were teachers expected to know and to pass on to their students? For hundreds of years in the types of schools that we would now call classical schools that were run by Jesuits according to the Ratio Studiorum, this is the famous school system of the Jesuits. If you browse the internet, you can find thousands of books written by Jesuits during this time period who were working in this system of schooling or who were educated by this system of schooling. They're written all in Latin, and they're about topics that range from what you might expect, classical rhetoric, grammar of Greek and Latin, to grammars of other languages. The Jesuits were active all over the world at this time, so some of the first grammars we have of global languages other than Latin and Greek are written in Latin. You will also find books on topics like philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, geography, some of them at the time really influential, foundational, important texts. You can find text relating to military history. You can find entire libraries, small libraries full of books on theology. You can find correspondences written by Jesuits and histories of the various activities that they were engaged in, again, all over the world. It would take a lifetime, maybe several, to be able just to read through all of this material, all of it in Latin. So in this video, I'm going to be sharing some advice that was given by what you can think of as a sort of teacher's manual for teachers who were working within this system in schools that were arranged according to the Ratio Studiorum. This is a manual called De Ratione, Discendi et Docendi, the way to learn first as a teacher, and then the way to teach what you have learned. And this is a book written by a French Jesuit named Joseph de Jouvency, I think is how it would be pronounced. It's Josephus Juvencius in Latin. So this is a book that was published in 1703, and it was basically paired with the Ratio Studiorum. So the Ratio Studiorum, of course, was a curriculum, series of sort of rules about how the schools had to be run and what the requirements were for them. This book, the De Ratione, Discendi et Docendi, was often provided as a kind of guide to teachers in particular so that they understood what they needed to be able to do on their own, what they had to do on their own in order to be good teachers, first in terms of their own formation, and then what they needed to do in the classroom to be successful as teachers. So the first part of the book, Jouvency basically summarizes at the very outset there in a kind of little preface that we're going to be looking at today. He outlines what is it that the knowledge and skill that a good classical, a good humanist teacher is going to have. What does it consist of? And he says that it consists of three different things. So he says it consists of language proficiency, what he calls cognitio et peritia linguarum. So I'm gonna call that language proficiency. It's basically knowing, cognitio, and then also peritia, and being skilled in the languages. And he's talking specifically about Latin and Greek here, although he does mention slightly vernacular languages. But basically, you have to be good at Latin and Greek. You have to really know them. He talks about domain-specific knowledge, what he calls perceptio quarundam scientiarum, quibus bonarum artium curriculum quodab absolvitur, which basically means you have to know about certain fields of knowledge that are that make up a sort of curriculum of bonarum, what he calls bonarum artium, what we would now kind of call the classic liberal arts, humanistic studies, various names, but we'll look at what exactly that consists of. And then the third section that he divides this first half of the book into is basically study skills, what he calls non nulla ad studendum adminicula. Basically, like, what are some additional things, some additional helps that you need in order to be successful studying, so that as a teacher you can be successful teaching your students. So today we're going to look at what each of these three things are. I'm calling these things language proficiency, domain-specific knowledge and study skills, basically. We're going to look at just the overview of what these things look like in the book. So the first thing that de Jouvency says that a good humanist, a good classical teacher needs to have, the first thing that their eruditio, their learning, consists of is peritia et cognitio linguarum, is language proficiency. So what does that mean? He's talking here about Greek first, although he's not primarily thinking of speaking Greek, but he is thinking of a really good working reading and writing knowledge of Greek. And then, of course, Latin, and even more so really Latin. I mean, he places Greek as, maybe we'll see in a later video, he places Greek as the first and sort of, he says, most important language in some ways to really build your erudition, your eruditio. But on the other hand, it's obvious that Latin is he spends more time talking about how to learn Latin well, and he spends even less time explaining why you would need to learn it, because in this time period, it is obvious. This is the international academic and intellectual language of Europe and places where there's European colonies. So he takes it for granted, basically, like, yeah, of course you need to really, really know Latin well. This knowledge of Latin for de Jouvency consists of, so a teacher has to have deep grammatical knowledge, and in particular, they have to be able to imitate certain classical exemplars really well. So in prose, you have to be able to imitate Cicero, and in poetry, you have to be able to imitate Virgil. And of course, both of these authors and tons of other authors have to be really well known to you. You have to be very well read in these authors in order to develop the language skill that you need. Furthermore, then you have to develop your style, particularly as a writer, although it is assumed and stated explicitly also that you're going to be using the languages in speaking, and that you're going to be speaking in Latin in particular. But there's also a significant emphasis placed on, obviously, being able to write really well and in a variety of different styles. You have to be able to write letters. You have to be able to write sort of historical prose. You have to be able to write sort of boilerplate academic prose. You also have to be able, and this is really important for the Jesuits in particular, you have to be able to write good speeches, orations, and then you have to be able to deliver them. So these are all additional things. So we have this language proficiency, Greek and especially Latin, really, really solid proficiency in a whole bunch of different types of Latin prose, being able to write all kinds of different Latin prose, and eventually even being able to compose some poetry. And then he also talks about the importance of avoiding certain kind of common errors and faults in style. This is just a particular, this sounds normal enough. It was a particular concern for early modern pedagogues to make sure that they were avoiding some of what they saw as egregious mistakes that people started to make during the Middle Ages. So that's the first section. You have to have this language proficiency, and he places that first, I think, because that's the bedrock. If you do not have deep, deep, deep knowledge and skill in Greek and Latin, then really there's nothing that you can offer a student in this kind of classical school. The second thing that a good teacher has to have, a good teacher has to know, the second thing that their eruditio consists of, is what I've called domain-specific knowledge. He says that perceptio quarundam scientiarum, and it's a sort of longer phrase that I don't repeat here, but the idea is there's an entire sort of curriculum of these sorts of humanistic studies, and you have to know at least something, and a lot of some of them, something of all of them. So what are these studies that he's talking about? Because nowadays, the impression that I have of what people are calling classical education now, and I say this mostly as an outsider, is that people are thinking of, maybe they've heard of like the trivium and the quadrivium, or they have this idea that it's just about kind of like reading great books in a general sense, in a kind of global sense. De Jouvency, in the course of the book, goes into great detail about exactly what the domains of knowledge are that you have to have in order to be a successful teacher in a classical school setting like this, in a humanistic school setting. And then, obviously, we can learn from this and from the second half of the book what it is that students were learning. What you will find basically is the following. You have to be good at rhetoric, and in particular, not just rhetorical analysis in the classical sense, And these are basically following the precepts laid down by Aristotle, by Cicero in his De Inventione, and in the work that was thought to be Cicero's for many years, the Rhetorica ad Herennium. So you have to know classical rhetoric. It's a very detailed body of knowledge about and rhetorical, essentially, analysis. And then you also have to know it from an active sense. You have to be able to write speeches, declamations that sort of follow this model of composition. What else do you need to know? You have to know poetry. You have to be able to analyze poetry well. You have to be able to read poetry well. There's a particular focus in the Jesuit curriculum on epic poetry and on dramatic poetry. They loved writing these plays. There, you can find hundreds and thousands of them. Again, just you can find them on the internet. They wrote school plays, plays on sacred topics, plays on secular topics, and so you also have to obviously study the authors that these styles are based on. You have to know all about all the different kinds of poetry, and in particular, he's thinking of Latin. Although obviously, as I've stated, there is a premium placed on Greek. You have to know what the ultimate source of all of this is in Greek, and then you have to be able to apply that in Latin. What are some of the other fields? You have to know some history, especially the history that you would learn from the classical authors and that you would need in order to profitably read the classical authors. You have to know what they called chronology. And this is something that we kind of take for granted now, knowing when things happen and how dates line up. But actually, there's obviously a very long and complicated process over the medieval and early modern period of exactly figuring out how all these different ways of understanding when things happened in history, how they all line up. And the Jesuits did a ton of work on this. There's some really influential books that help us actually figure out kind of like when stuff happened and what kinds of dating systems we should use in order to be consistent in thinking about these things. You have to know some geography. You have to know kind of, again, mostly what you need to know in order to be able to read classical authors and also what you would learn from reading classical authors. And then the final category that's really fun is what he calls polymathy or philology, philologia, and this is not really what we think of when we think of philologia or philology nowadays. I think if people are familiar with that at all, they're probably thinking of this kind of Germanic philology from the really that golden age of Germanic philology in the 1800s. What he's talking about here is basically kind of curiosities, things like riddles, heraldic crests, numismatics, the study of coins, epigraphy. So these are things that eventually I think even archaeology sort of grows out of this field, but at the time, again, he's writing in the 1600s and initial drafts of this book, and then it's published in the early 1700s. At the time, these were all kinds of just like interesting curiosities that any educated person should know something about. So just to sum up, you have to know rhetoric, poetry, history, chronology, geography, and then all of the things that fall under polymathy or philology. You're going to notice that some things are missing here. So there is no mention of the study of philosophy, mathematics, physics, any of the natural sciences, or even theology. Now, that's not to say that these things weren't considered in some ways to be even more important, and they were studied at the highest possible levels in these Jesuit schools. But it's important to keep in mind, this book was written for teachers who are going to be teaching the studia inferiora, basically what they call the lower studies. This lower course of studies that covers basically what I just mentioned, the idea of grammar, rhetoric, poetry, and then the things you would need in order to get really, really good at studying those things. This lower level of studies is what we now would probably think of. It's not exact, but you can kind of compare it to middle school and high school. So students who are somewhere between the ages of like 10 and 18, somewhere in there, are going to spend at least 2 years in the first level of grammar, a year in the second, a year in the third, a course called humanitas, which was basically the kind of capstone of that grammar and literature course, and then the course on rhetoric, retorica. So you're talking about at least 6 years, and for some students, obviously, if they move, the students were allowed to move very quickly if they could, but for most students, actually, it would take at least 6, maybe 7, maybe 8 years to actually move through this. And for the vast majority of students who move through these schools, that's all they studied, because they're not all and then able to go on to the superior. It's a relatively small number. So I think that's something that maybe people who are familiar with, and again, I say this mostly as an outsider, but maybe an interested outsider, people who are familiar with the idea of classical schooling nowadays, they're thinking, I think it seems to me to be the case that a lot of the curricula are kind of like they're doing astronomy or like mathematics and stuff like that with kids who are in like 6th grade. There was obviously, before students got to these kinds of Jesuit schools, there's a certain amount of basic literacy and numeracy that they're learning either with a tutor or in some of the academic literature calls it like ABC schools or some kind of elementary schooling. But this kind of classical humanistic education for the vast majority of students in these schools, which are some of the best schools of this kind during this golden age of this period, they're mostly spending their time on Latin and Greek, getting incredibly good at those languages, and then kind of branching into, I guess developing that ability into a certain kind of really, really skilled rhetorical capacity to use those languages and that knowledge. So that was considered to be enough. That took up basically the whole education for 8 years. And then you could start going on to philosophy, to higher studies like mathematics, theology, things like that. But you weren't allowed in any way to move on to those superiora studia, things like physics and math, and like theology was obviously the peak for the Jesuits of all of these studies. You weren't allowed to move on to those until you had mastered the basics of the grammar and the literature and the skill in using those things in a rhetorical way. So that's the second of the 3 things you have to have in order to be a good teacher, because you have to be able to give those things, provide those things to your students. The third category is kind of short. It won't take too long. It's the smallest part of the first half of the book. These are what he calls non nulla ad studendum ad minicula. I'm calling them just basically study skills. And this is basically a kind of cute little section on how to read, how to take notes, the order of study. He offers some sort of possible, and I mean, this is really what's fascinating about this book. He gets into kind of the nitty gritty of like how you could order your schedule, especially if as a teacher, you have to start teaching before you're actually really completely done learning, and maybe you're never done learning. So he kind of offers like, all right, if your day looks like this as a teacher in one of these schools, you can kind of, spend an hour doing this and an hour doing that on a daily basis. And that's how you will continue to grow and build what you need to have in order to be effective as a teacher. And then again, he also kind of provides some examples of common mistakes, things that you shouldn't do if you want to be effective. Don't read too widely. Don't, waste your time in the morning and then only study things late at night when you're tired. So just to sum up, de Jouvency outlines in this book that is basically the official teacher's manual for teachers who are teaching in these, like some of the best classical schools, humanistic schools during one of the most fruitful periods of this kind of teaching and learning. He says that these are the 3 things that a good teacher has to have. You have to have language proficiency in the classical languages, not just knowledge of, not just the ability to read well and deeply and broadly, although you do have to have that, but you also have to be able to actually use them. So that's the first thing. You have to have that language skill. You have to have domain-specific knowledge, but the domains are somewhat limited, I think, from the kind of modern perception. You have to have domain-specific knowledge of poetry. So they have to have that deep literary knowledge. You have to know a lot about rhetoric, both, again, from an analytical perspective and also from a use perspective. You have to know enough history, chronology, and geography to be able to contextualize and understand everything you're reading. And you kind of need to know, the little kind of cool, interesting stuff, the polymathy or the philology, the curiosities that can kind of enliven the studies. And so that's the second thing, those domains. And then you need to have the sort of study skills, the adminicula. What are the things that you need to know in order to be effective as a scholar? So that's basically it. And when I say that's basically it, I don't want to soft pedal it and act like this is not a lot. I think from the modern perspective, it might be surprising because I think a lot of people have this idea that in what we can call pre-modern schooling, there was this really, really deep knowledge of things that we would class under the quadrivium in the liberal arts. And although those things were important, certainly in the Middle Ages and still in the higher studies in the early modern period, we can see, I think, even just from this overview, that it was considered to be enough, and it really was, and this makes sense. And maybe I am habetior, maybe I'm a little duller than the average person who engages in these studies, but I can say for myself, it certainly seems like enough just to be able to actually learn Latin and Greek well and develop deep knowledge of the literature, the classical literature in Greek and Latin. That's enough to consume a significant amount of schooling. So I hope that this has been an interesting window into this world for you, and I hope that if you're interested or you found this video interesting, that you will continue to tune in here at intervals for additional insights from this book. So thank you for sharing some time with me. Bene valete.